Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first in a three-part webinar series on restoring our kelp forest. Tonight's webinar is entitled Kelp Restoration, a Blueprint for a Healthy Ocean, and we have Dr. Sara Hamilton with us. My name is Kent Doty. I am the Coastal Conservation Coordinator for Seven Capes Bird Alliance. And I just want to express our appreciation for our partners who help promote this webinar series: ORKA Alliance, Oregon Kelp Alliance, Oregon Shores, and Friends of Outer Rock. Thank you for helping get the word out and keep on doing all the amazing work that you do for our marine world. I also want to give a shout out to Nissa Parker, our very own Seven Capes digital media coordinator, who did a lot of the work setting this up and made the webinar possible. This is a webinar format, so only the panelists are visible. The audience is muted for courtesy of the speaker. Following introductions, Sara will talk for about an hour on the topic. Then there'll be plenty of time for question and answers. As we progress through the talk, if you have any questions, either on the top or the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A tab, and you can write your questions in there, and we'll take those questions after Sara's presentation. Just so you know, the webinar is being recorded and will be posted on Seven Capes YouTube channel. A little bit about who we are. Seven Capes Bird Alliance, formerly the Audubon Society of Lincoln City, has been serving Tillamook and Lincoln counties since 2006. Our core programs are education, community science, and conservation action. We offer monthly birding outings suitable for all ages and all knowledge levels. We provide conservation focus areas include forest practices, rocky habitats, marine reserves, water quality, and threats to birds and wildlife, all viewed through the lens of climate change. Learn more about us at sevencapes.org. And I will put a plug in for our next webinar coming up. Mark your calendar and please register for the next webinar in this series. That will be May 7th, 6 to 7:30, and we'll continue to explore the wonderful world of kelp. The next webinar is entitled Life in the Kelp, Predators, Prey, and Ecosystem Balance. Miles Ruff, a Ph.D. student at University of Oregon, will be sharing about ecological balance of he'll be talking about sunflower stars, voracious purple urchins, and majestic kelp and how they interplay in an ecological balance and what happens when that goes awry. Then finally, the third, coming up in June 3rd, is Chanel Hasten from ORKA Alliance. So I think it should be a really good series. I hope you attend all three. The webinars are free, but registration is required. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land that we are living on here. Before the period of white settlement, the land and waters that we now occupy on the Oregon coast were home to the Tillamook and Alsea peoples. It is right and just to recognize these sovereign Indian nations and to remember the dispossessions they were forced to endure. Despite these losses, Tillamook and Alsea people continue to thrive and act collectively as part of the existing confederations. As we engage with the wildlife and the environment that surrounds us today, we pledge to learn from these nations, the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz, and our neighbors, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. We look forward to collaborating on common goals. Now, to introduce tonight's speaker. We feel extremely fortunate to have Dr. Sara Hamilton, the science coordinator for the Oregon Kelp Alliance, with us this evening. Before coming to Oregon Kelp Alliance, Sara received her Ph.D. studying kelp forest ecology and conservation at Oregon State University. She also did a postdoctoral research at the University of California, Davis, researching patterns of hypoxia and acidification on the California current and the effects on shellfish. At ORKA, which is Oregon Kelp Alliance, she led the writing of the 2024 Kelp Forest Status Report and is helping to implement the NOAA-funded Oregon Kelp Forest Stewardship Initiative. Sara's work on kelp restoration goes beyond just a solid scientific approach. I've known Sara for a few years, and she has an absolute passion for all things ocean, and I'm confident that you'll come away from tonight's presentation with a renewed commitment yourself for good stewardship and an advocate for the health of the ocean. So with that, I will turn it over to Sara.
Thank you, Kent. That was really kind. I'm going to send a request to share my slides, share my screen. Request has been sent. Share. There we go. Okay. Okay. There we go. My slides are up. I'm sorry, I can't get rid of the internet bar up top. I'm using Google Slides and couldn't figure it out. But we'll have a good time today anyway. Thank you all so much for being here. I recognize a few people from the participants list. I'm really glad to have you here. Thank you, Kent, for that kind introduction, for hosting this. My name is Sara Hamilton. I'm the science coordinator for the Kelp Alliance. I am from the East Coast originally, and I moved out here in 2017 to do my PhD at Oregon State University. And since 2023, I have been lucky enough to work for the Oregon Kelp Alliance. So I'm excited to get a chance to chat with y'all today. So today's talk is going to be a little bit of a meandering story, I think. I think it'll be analogous to the way this gray whale over here is meandering through the kelp forests outside of Depot Bay. I'm going to start with just a little bit of basic terminology. What are kelp forests exactly? And then I'll kind of do past, present, and future of ORKA. So how did ORKA come to be? What do we know about the current status of Oregon's kelp forests? Is ORKA currently doing to steward our kelp forests? And then what's the long-term vision? What does the future look like? And then I'm hoping we'll have a good chunk of time for some question and answers. So let's get started. So just to be on the same page, what the heck is a kelp anyway? So kelps, the definition of them is they're large brown marine seaweeds, usually in the biological order Laminariales. They photosynthesize the way that plants do, but they're not technically plants. Algae and plants are different. They live in cool, shallow waters, and they actually line about a quarter of the world's coastlines. So they're actually incredibly widely distributed coastal ecosystems. There are many different species of kelp, and one term that you might hear me using throughout the presentation is canopy and subcanopy kelps. So similar to the way in the forest, in a terrestrial forest, you have canopy-forming trees and subcanopy trees. In a kelp forest, our canopy kelps are our dug firs. They're the ones that reach all the way to the surface and kind of create this super canopy of vegetation. And then we've got our subcanopy kelps, which are kind of more like maybe like the vine maples of the forest. They don't grow as tall as the canopy kelps do, but there's a number of different species and they have an important role to play in the system as well. And just like how on lands, the presence of trees creates not just more trees, but a whole ecosystem, the presence of kelp in the ocean creates an ecosystem, the kelp forest. So one of the reasons that I'm in love with Oregon's kelp forest is that not just for the kelps themselves, which I do love, but it's because they're critical habitat for many of Oregon's iconic species like gray whales, abalone, sunflower stars, cabezon, lingcod. And by being critical habitat for so many important critters, they become important to coastal communities as well. So that's what kelps are. Now that we've got that little bit of terminology out of the way, let's kind of start meandering through the story of ORKA. So how did ORKA come to be? What is our origin story? So when I first moved out to Oregon, it was 2017, and nobody was talking about kelp. There was very little to no study going on. There was very little data. And so that's actually why I wanted to study it when I was at Oregon State. I had a lot of questions that nobody seemed to have answers to. And so as I'm working on my PhD at Oregon State, folks on the south coast of Oregon started noticing changes in Oregon's kelp forests. And this was particularly coming from both commercial urchin divers, so urchin fishermen, as well as groundfish fishermen that are fishing in these kelp forest habitats, particularly in the Port Orford area, so down on the south coast. And some of these fishermen were coming to Tom Calvini's. Some of you may know Tom. He's an ex-urchin diver, and at that time, he was the manager of OSU's Port Orford Field Station. And he was hearing these stories from his old fishing buddies and getting really concerned. And he started looking around and realizing that places that used to look like the spot on the left here, with these verdant kelp forests, now looked like what you see on the right. There just wasn't anything there. Um, and it was shocking and a little upsetting to Tom. And he started asking himself, well, if the kelp isn't there anymore, what does that mean for the rockfish the baby rockfish use kelp forests as critical nursery habitat? And what does this mean for abalone that eat kelp? What does it mean for the whales that like to forage in the kelp? And what does it mean for fishermen like my old urchin diving buddies who are having to kind of change their fishing grounds now? Um, and so that was when Tom was inspired to create the Oregon Kelp Alliance back in about 2020. It was created in response to these concerns from community members and commercial fishermen. And it was formed to be a alliance of diverse interests of people that were interested in meaningfully restoring and protecting Oregon's kelp forests. And so that's important to us. We're an action-oriented organization. We're not just here to document and study and educate. We're here to do something about taking care of Oregon's kelp forests. So let's orient you a little bit more to Oregon's kelp forests. So in Oregon, we have our canopy and our subcanopy species. And our iconic canopy species is on the left here. It's bull kelp. Scientific name is Nereocystis leucana, which is actually derived from the Greek words meaning mermaid's purse or mermaid's bladder, which refers to, you can kind of see that bulb at the top of the bull kelp. It's this little gas-filled bulb that's actually filled with carbon monoxide. That is a little buoy for the kelp and holds it up at the surface, creating that canopy. So that's our iconic canopy species, but we actually have a bunch of different subcanopy species as well. And over here on the right, you can see in the background some of these subcanopy species. We have wide-ribbed kelp, old-growth kelp, torn blade kelp, probably 5 or 6 ones that you see pretty regularly in the subcanopy. And where do you find Oregon's kelp forests? Well, one of the important things about kelps is that they can only grow on rocky substrate, rocky seafloor. So unlike plants, plants have roots that grow into the soil. Um, Kelps need to suction onto rocks as opposed to sandy or sandy bottoms. And so you need rocky coastline in the right depth for kelp forest to flourish. And so historically in Oregon, we had some patchy kelp forests in the northern half of the state, around places like Pacific City, Cape Lookout, Depot Bay, Newport area. But the real heart of our kelp forest habitat has always been the south coast, and that's from about Cape Arago down through Brookings. That is where about probably 90+% of the historical kelp canopy was. But as the slide says, the times they are a-changing. There have been a century or more of changes kind of stacking up in our coastal environments that have been kind of hard on kelp forests. And so in the late 1800s, sea otters, an urchin predator, were driven extinct by the Hudson Bay Fur Company. From the 1860s onwards, American colonists began displacing diverse indigenous peoples and the marine stewardship regimes of those indigenous peoples as those colonists settle and develop the coast. From the 2000s onwards, we're seeing increasing impacts of global climate change, things like marine heat waves, acidification, changes in upwelling intensity. From 2014 to 2016, the Oregon coast, along with the whole coast of North America, is hit by sea star wasting disease, which in Oregon takes out a very important sea star for our story, which is the sunflower sea star, which I'll talk more about here in a little while. And then, as I mentioned, in 2019, these urchin divers stopped fishing Orford Reef, which was historically one of their most important fishing grounds, due to poor quality urchins that don't have enough to eat. And so that's where ORKA is kind of like 2020, 2021. We're hearing from community members that there's a problem, that we're losing our kelp forests. But how much are we losing, and where are we losing it? Are we losing it everywhere, or is it only certain places? And why are we losing it? We just had a lot of questions that we couldn't answer. We didn't know what the scope of the problem was, particularly because there wasn't a lot of monitoring going on in the state. And so where did we have to start? We had to start by doing some of that monitoring and understanding what the current status is. And so our first task was to document the problem. And with support from Senator Jeff Merkley and Senator Ron Wyden, ORKA received NOAA funds to do just that, to assess the status of Oregon's kelp forests. There is a report online that you can all access and read if you want the juicy details. So the 2024 Oregon Kelp Forest Status Report, but I'll go through and hit some of the highlights of what we found from that. So how did we assess status? Well, we wanted to look both at what did Oregon's kelp forests used to look like and what do they look like now, so that we could understand change over time. And so there were some historical sources of data on Oregon's kelp forests, both aerial surveys of canopy forming kelps, bull kelp from ODF and W, as well as some limited scuba dive based time series from Reef Check. But the real kind of core of what we did was in 2023, we did this blitzkrieg of monitoring up and down the coast. We did about 170 dive surveys up and down the coast. And I think I see a few participants who on the webinar who were part of that, as well as doing 21 drone surveys to try to understand, okay, well, where are our kelp forests now? This was a huge team effort. We worked with Reef Check, Oregon State, ODF and W, the Coast Aquarium, and Oregon Institute of Marine Biology to get this done. And so we needed a teamwork. We needed teamwork to make the dream work. So what did we find? Some of the key kind of highlights are in 2022, there was about 70% less bull kelp in the state than there was in 2010. As of 2023, when we did our dive surveys, large swaths of historic kelp forest habitat supported little to no kelp, particularly in the Port Orford and Brookings area in the heart of our historic kelp forest habitat. We found strong evidence that increasing purple urchin densities are a key driver of this sudden shift in our ecosystem. And in addition to loss, we actually found some exciting signs of resilience that I want to share with y'all. So to talk a little bit more about each one of those, overall, we found that in about a decade and a half, we had about 70% less bull kelp in 2022 than 2010. So a rapid loss of a big chunk of bull kelp forests across the state. But those losses aren't occurring evenly everywhere. They're occurring in some places and not in other places. So I know there's a lot of maps here, but basically on the left over here, this one big map along the left, that is from aerial data. So that's only looking at bull kelp canopy. And what you can see is that while there were places that lost a lot of their bull kelp canopy, for instance, Orford Reef lost about 95%, Cape Lookout about 92%, the Cape Lookout area, which includes Pacific City. There are also some places that were kind of stable over time. So Rogue Reef at the mouth of the Rogue River in Gold Beach was pretty much about the same in 2022 as 2010. And then Cape Erico actually had seen an increase in kelp over that time. So that's kind of, looking down on the canopy. But then over here on the right, some of these maps show what we found in our scuba survey. So those capture many species, not just bull kelp. And there's a lot going on in these maps, but basically what I want to note is every one of these dots is a place where we did a scuba survey. And the color of the dot indicates how many kelps we found on that scuba survey. And so we were targeting places that we knew historically had kelp forest habitat. So theoretically, all of these places should have some kelp. And the thing to really note is I want to point out these the Port Orford area, kind of in the middle bottom row here, and then the Brookings area. And so if you'll notice, those dots don't have a color, actually. Most of them are just these empty dots with a black circle around them. And that means that there was absolutely no kelp found on that survey. And you can see the vast majority of surveys in the Port Orford and the Brookings area actually found zero kelp. So this is, the heart of our historic kelp forest habitat. And dive after dive after dive after dive, we're not seeing any kelps. So that's not just loss. That's not just a decline in the population. That's like total loss of the habitat in some of these places. So what's driving these losses? We found evidence that it's increasing purple urchin densities. So we actually had some time series from ODF&W as well as Reef Check that looked at urchin densities in one place over time. And we found that almost everywhere that we looked, there was some level of increase in purple urchin densities since about 2010. I mean, in some places, those increases were really severe, up to 1,000-fold. And so my analogy is always kind of like if you have an acre of pasture and you have one goat on that acre of pasture, you're good to go. But if all of a sudden you have 1,000 goats on that acre of pasture, you don't have a pasture anymore. You just have dirt, right? And urchins, kelp is their favorite food. So with these huge increases in urchins, they're grazing down all the kelp, and that's a large driver of why we're not seeing any more kelp. So why are urchins increasing all of a sudden? Well, there's two things. One of the big drivers that we know of is that there aren't any more major urchin predators left in the system. So sea otters were an important urchin predator. Those have been gone since the late 1800s. And then nobody really realized until sea star wasting disease hit that the sunflower sea star, these big, like 3 foot wide predatory sea stars, were actually eating a lot of urchins too. And so when we lost sunflower sea stars, we lost the last major urchin predator in the system. And it's right around that time that we start seeing these huge increases in particularly purple urchins. So they're a native species. They've always been here. They're just wildly overpopulated now. So we know predators, loss of predators is part of the equation, but we also know that climate change is probably playing into these increases in urchin densities as well. So there's some evidence that warming temperatures in this area make it easier for urchins to reproduce. So kind of a double whammy effect. So, loss of about 70% of kelp in 10 to 15 years is really sobering. That's bad news. But we also found some things that we were really excited about in our 2027 monitoring and survey work. And two of them that I want to share with you. This first one is that bull kelp forest in the Cape Foulweather area, so kind of like south of Depot Bay, actually had a historically good year in 2023. And so what you see here is a drone survey that I did in 2023 of the Otter Crest area. And on the left, you can kind of see that drone map. Everything in brown is that floating bull kelp canopy. And then on the right, what I've done is I've highlighted all the 2023 kelp in bright pink, and then I've overlaid it with where was there kelp in 1990. So ODF&W has these old aerial maps of kelp extent from the 90s. And so that green outline is where the kelp forest was in 1990. And you can see that they're basically the same size. If, in fact, there might be a little bit more kelp in 2023. So in 2023, the kelp forests were looking just as healthy and happy in Cape Foulweather as they were back in the 90s. We don't exactly know why that is, but we do know this area has fewer urchins than a lot of other parts, a lot of other areas that we surveyed. So that's probably part of it. But so some places are doing quite well. And then the other thing that happened in 2023 that was really, really exciting was that it was the first year that people actually started seeing sunflower stars back in Oregon after they had been absolutely decimated by wasting disease. And so this time series here shows the number of sightings of sunflower sea stars documented on iNaturalist and seastarwasting.org, which are community science sites. And you can see that for a number of years, no one was seeing any sunflower stars at all. And then in 2023, there was this sudden spike, and people were finding these juvenile sunflower sea stars. You can see a picture of one over here on the right. We had over 50 unique observations of sunflower sea stars in 2023 on these sites, and then over 100 in 2024. And so sunflower sea stars, their populations are not back at full strength in Oregon, but they started to reestablish this tentative, foothold in the state, which is really, really good news. So that was what we found. A lot of problems, but also a lot of things that gave us hope about the future. And so while documenting loss is important, we need to know where we are to figure out what to do about it. The documentation itself doesn't actually change what's happening. So in 2025, we kind of kicked off work to try to change the current trajectory of Oregon's kelp forests. In 2025, ORKA got to kick off the Oregon Kelp Forest Stewardship Initiative, a project funded by NOAA from 2025 through 2027 that is funding restoration and preservation of kelp forest habitat at 6 different sites up and down the coast. You can see them over there on the left: Cape Lookout, Pacific City, Cape Foulweather, South Cove, Nelly's Cove, and Macklin Cove. So spread out from Cape Lookout all the way down to Brookings. And to do this kelp forest stewardship work, we're kind of focusing on three main strategies, which is one, you got to get the urchins out of there. When you've got 1,000 goats on that acre of pasture, there's no way your grass is ever going to grow back. And so these sites, we just have got to get the urchin densities down. Then once those urchins are out of there, you can start doing spore enhancement. And so what that basically is you want to coat that site, that seafloor, with kelp reproductive material, so that once the urchins are out of there, that kelp can reestablish quickly. And then the final kind of piece of that is we want to start working towards large-scale recovery of sunflower sea stars in Oregon as a method of kelp forest recovery. So one of the ways that we had to start somewhere. One of the ways we started doing that is by translocating sunflower sea stars to some of our restoration sites to see if they can help control urchin populations there. So those are our kind of restoration interventions. And then in addition to this, we're doing a bunch of scuba and drone monitoring at all of these sites. So 2025 was our first year. It was really exciting. It was crazy. It was a lot of throwing spaghetti up against a wall and seeing what worked. We get to work with some really amazing partners in this that were so patient and dedicated last year. So just a lot of gratitude towards those partners listed out here. And so I want to give you some highlights from our 2025 season. So in 2025, we focused work at 3 of our 6 sites. We needed to kind of start a little bit smaller. And so we focused on Kiwanda Rock in Pacific City, where we did culling, Nelly's Cove in Port Orford, where we did culling, spore enhancement, and sunflower sea star translocations, and then Macklin Cove in Brookings, where we did culling and spore enhancement. And so I'll kind of go strategy by strategy and talk about what we were able to get done. So in 2025, our urchin culling work, we were working under letters of authorization from ODF&W. This was actually kind of a brand new permitting type pathway from ODF&W that allowed us to do culling at these 3 specific sites. And it worked really well for us. We appreciated ODF&W's partnership in making that work. It allowed us to work with both commercial urchin divers as well as volunteer divers who were doing the culling. And in 2025, we were able to clear out about 363,000 urchins across these 3 sites. So that was 47,000 from Kiwanda, 216,000 from Nelly's Cove, and 100,000 from Macklin Cove. So we were able to get a lot of urchins out of those sites that were preventing any kelps from being able to reestablish. So as I said, once those kelps are out of there, we want to rain spores down over the seafloor to make sure that kelp can reestablish. And so to do this spore enhancement work, we had never done it in Oregon before. So we tried 2 totally brand new methods to us. The first was growing bull kelps on kelp restoration platforms at Nelly's Cove. That's the picture that you see on the left here. Basically, the idea was if we grow the kelps on the seafloor, any remaining urchins are going to eat them up. So instead, we're going to grow them on these platforms so that they can grow to adulthood, become reproductive, and then literally shower spores all over the site. And this was cool. This was really fun to get to do in 2025 because it was a brand new method that we were trying out in partnership with our collaborators at the Nature Conservancy in California and Moss Landing Marine Labs. So we took a design that they had tried out in California and tried it here and had some success with it. We were able to grow bull kelps in Nellie's Cove on these platforms. And then additionally, we also tried spore bags, which basically take reproductive material from wild harvested, selectively harvested or cultured kelps and put them in these biodegradable spore bags. And we did that at Macklin Cove. And we found that both sites had new kelp recruits, so basically little guys, little kelplings, within 2 to 3 months of urchin removal. And we think a lot of that had to do with our spore enhancement. And I want to show you what that looks like. Um, so we weren't able to survey Kiwanda in the fall, but we were able to survey Nellies and Macklin. And so over here on the left, you see drone images of Macklin Cove. And Macklin was really just the star of the show. Within 1 to 2 months of the culling work that happened, we had a full-grown bull kelp at the site. And this, you can see the area in orange in 2025, the area with the orange dashes is where we were doing our culling work. And then the 3 orange stars is where we were putting spore bags. And so the places where we were doing work, literally within a couple months, kelp was popping up that in places that it hadn't been documented in like 5 to 10 years. So that was incredibly exciting. And we didn't see full-grown adult kelps at Nellie's Cove, but over here on the right, you can see within a couple months of culling, we saw juvenile bull kelps recruiting and growing in Nellie's Cove. And this was it seems like such a small thing. Literally, they're just a few centimeters big. But I've been diving Nellie's Cove since 2019, I think, and I've never ever seen wild kelp growing there. So to see these little juvenile ones popping up so soon after we got some of those urchins out of there, it was incredibly exciting. We didn't expect to see any new kelps in 2025. We thought if we were going to see new kelp, it wouldn't happen until 2026. So this actually surpassed even our own hopes for the success that we were hoping for. Um, so that was huge. And then sunflower sea star translocation work. We worked with researchers at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, as well as Oregon Institute of Marine Biology, who collected 24 sunflower sea stars, also known as pycnos, from the Port Orford area, from the wild, held them for about a month at the Oregon Coast Aquarium. And then we outplanted them in cages for observation to make sure that we could transplant them, translocate them safely. We weren't introducing disease, we weren't killing them. They all survived quite nicely. And then they were released into Nellie's Cove and observed for several days, several weeks afterwards to see what kind of effect they had on the urchins around them. And we found that they were indeed eating purple urchins and they were scared. Not only were they eating them, they scare purple urchins away. So there was about a 12-foot radius or 24-foot diameter circle around an individual sea star where the urchins moved away because they could sense a predator was nearby, which is really cool. And so they part of the way sea stars work have this effect on kelp is like not only are they eating the urchins, the urchins are spending so much time worrying about predators that they're not eating as much kelp. And so we were only able to do that at one site, but we had high survivorship and good outcomes. So that was our 2025 year. It was very exciting. We got so much done. And 2026, we're just now starting the field season. It's kind of like we do everything just bigger, better, faster, stronger. This year, we're going to be working at all 6 sites. We'll be doing scuba and drone surveys again at all sites. All sites are also going to have urchin removals. How we do those urchin removals kind of varies by site. In some places, we're culling with commercial divers. Some places, we're culling with commercial and volunteer divers. And some places, we're actually not going to cull. We're not going to smash urchins at all. we're going to be working with commercial urchin divers to harvest more urchins out of it for the fishery. In addition, all sites are either going to have these kelp recovery platforms to grow adult bull kelps on, or they're going to receive spore bags for spore enhancement. We are going to be translocating more sunflower sea stars, at least to Ladies Cove and hopefully to another site as well, pending ODF&W permits. And we are actually working with the Oregon Coast Aquarium and the Oregon Zoo on the really early stages of trying to develop a sunflower sea star captive breeding program here in Oregon, which is something that's been piloted in Washington and California and is showing good signs of success. So that's what we're, throwing ourselves into right now. We'll be doing this in 2026, 2027, and hopefully more of that to come at larger scales in years beyond, depending on funding. But I also kind of want to think a little bit, not just about kind of the ecological side of it, but I want to think a little bit more about also the social and community sides of it and kind of think longer term. So in terms of, long term, we see the work that we're doing right now is kind of triage, right? Our kelp forests are in trouble. We're going to go in there and do these things to try to turn that trajectory around and restore some of them, protect some of the ones we have. But also we need this to become long-term stewardship. We need people to be here, keeping an eye on the kelp forests, taking care of them, intervening on their behalf for 10, 20, 50, 100 years into the future. And so to do that, we feel you need to build a culture around kelp forest stewardship in coastal communities. And to do that, you have to kind of also treat it not just as an ecological topic, but also as a social and an economic topic. And so some of the ways that we are trying to build culture and build economy and community around kelp forests include, these are just a couple of examples. So one of them is education and getting people involved. So for instance, you can't care about something that you don't know about. And when I first started working on kelp forests in Oregon, a lot of people had no idea that we had kelp forests here. So there's just a lot of basic education of like letting people know that these habitats are here and they're in trouble and there's things we can do about it. But also getting community members involved. One of the ways we do that is pretty much all of our scuba surveys actually are conducted by community science volunteers, some of which are on this webinar today. And so getting community members to not just scientists, not just government folk, to be the ones actually down there keeping an eye on the kelp forests, thinking about how we can help them implementing some of these restoration interventions. We want people to be involved hands-on in this work. And I want to shout out in particular Reef Check, which is an amazing organization that organizes the community science scuba diving surveys that we do. So another kind of aspect of this, kelp as a social and economic topic is building the blue economy and building economic incentives around kelp forest ecosystems. And one of the ways you can do that is through sustainable mariculture and creating industry associated with kelp forest ecosystems on the coast. And so ORKA right now is both working with industry partners who are already doing, for instance, purple urchin ranching at the Port of Bandon. You can see that picture there on the upper right-hand corner. As well as ORKA is starting to pilot actually growing kelp in the ocean for mariculture purposes. So not in places that it used, we're not trying to restore it in places it used to be, but actually growing it on lines to be used as food, to be used in agriculture, as fertilizer, and other sorts of products. And so creating good paying jobs in coastal communities that are associated with fishing and ecotourism and mariculture will help build economic incentives around kelp forest stewardship. And then finally, we also see it as really important to support tribal sovereignty and tribal stewardship. Historically, or Historically, our marine spaces were managed quite well by Oregon's indigenous peoples. Um, and through the process of colonization, those peoples, those tribes have lost a lot of access to the ocean, and they're not allowed to do a lot of their traditional collecting, hunting, fishing, as well as they're not able to take care of the ecosystems the way that they used to. And so we are working particularly closely with the Coquel Indian tribe and the Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siletz Indians to see what we can do to help them reestablish those connections to the ocean and to ocean stewardship. And two examples of this, one are we are working with those tribes to get more of their members and their staffs certified in scuba diving so that they can be the ones doing some of this monitoring or restoration. And then the picture above was actually a day that we went out and we harvested purple urchins, which is a traditional food for the Coquel tribe. We harvested purple urchins with them and showed them how to crack open urchins and scoop out uni and make uni butter from it and put it on fry bread. It was really good. So we're really grateful that we get to work with some of those tribes and think about how can we support tribal sovereignty in the long run. So as I kind of wrap up here today, I want to make sure that we have time for plenty of questions if folks have them. A few parting messages to kind of leave everyone with. One of the first ones is that Oregon has lost much of its kelp forest habitat. We have a real problem on our hands. And it's a problem not just for the kelp, but for coastal critters and coastal community members. We also feel like there's things that we can do about it. It's time to get to work, restoring the kelp that we've lost, as well as protecting what we still have. Um, and then finally, I spent a lot of time talking about the ecological pieces, the monitoring, the urchin removal, but we have to think about kelp forest stewardship and ocean stewardship in general as an ecological, a social, and an economic space. If we want conservation or stewardship to be successful, not just today, not just in the next 2 or 3 years, but over the long term. Um, as I wind down here, I want to note, it's called the Oregon Kelp the Oregon Kelp Alliance for a reason. We could never do this work all by ourselves. We work with so many amazing academic institutions and industry professionals and nonprofits that help us get this, help us do what we're able to do. And we're so grateful to all of them, including Seven Capes Bird Alliance, for helping with interpretive work at Cape Kiwanda and other places, helping us with outreach. And I just want to thank everybody for your time today, for being here, for giving a hoot about Oregon's kelp forests. And I will go ahead and take questions now. Curious if what kind of discussion people want to have. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was excellent and informative. We've got some questions coming in, and I hope people will put more questions in the Q&A. I will go ahead and read those to you, Sarah, as they come, and for your replies to them. And comments that are coming in the chat are very positive and enjoyed the talk. From Fawn Cusser, are you engaging in scuba shops? Are you engaging with scuba shops? That was brought up by Bill Hushemacher in an earlier meeting today.
Yeah, I would say we have started engaging with scuba shops. We're a small team with a limited kind of geographic scope. So we definitely work with Eugene skin divers. We have done some work with Coral Sea Scuba out of Grants Pass, but we would be interested in working more with scuba shops. Definitely one of the things that has been limiting Oregon's our stewardship of kelp forests in the past and continues to limit us today is that it's not the easiest place to dive. There aren't very many people diving. And so we really do see scuba diver training and getting more people in the water as critical to this building of culture around kelp forests, as well as actually doing the work, doing the urchin removals, doing the surveys. So please, if we haven't already engaged with you, it's just because we're at max capacity doing our best. Do feel free to reach out to me, or you can find a place to reach out on the Oregon Kelp Alliance website, and we would be happy to talk further.
And a comment from Karen: how does sea otter reintroduction play into kelp
Yeah.
restoration?
Yeah, so sea otters were historically part of the system. They were an important urchin predator. As many of you know, the ORKA Alliance works on sea otter reintroduction here in Oregon. And for us, it's a little bit of a matter of timelines right now, which is that sea otters aren't in Oregon right now, and sea otter reintroduction, apex predator reintroduction takes a long time. There's currently no permits to do that reintroduction. That effort is not underway. And when it does get underway, it's going to take years before we see the first sea otters in Oregon, and then it's going to take years, if not decades until those populations are at kind of full capacity here in Oregon. It's just because the way like marine mammals and vertebrates work, they have long lifespans. There's lots of permitting requirements around it. So in the long term, sea otter reintroduction could be really important to Oregon's kelp forests. But we're, like I mentioned, kind of in this triage mode where it's like, what can we do in the next 5 years to make sure we don't lose any more kelp forests, to make sure that Oregon's abalone populations don't go extinct. And so we're kind of using the tools that we feel like we can, the tools and the levers we feel like we can use right now and over the next 5 to 10 years. And so luckily, sunflower sea stars are beginning to come back. They're in the state. There's not nearly as many permitting requirements to working with them. And they have much faster generation times than sea otters. So they could be kind of a leading edge of getting some major urchin predator back in the system that helps us kind of hold on to our kelp forests until hopefully sometime in the future, sea otter reintroduction can occur.
And we'll hear more on our June 3rd webinar from Chanel Hayson about the process of reintroducing sea otters and what they're doing and the tribes are doing. Another question was, were both canopy and subcanopy kelp equally affected by the die-off?
That is such a good question. I don't get that question very often. I'm actually working on a paper right now that in part addresses this. So I would say in general, subcanopy and canopy kelps were both affected. We've seen declines in both over time, but I think it's been more severe for bull kelp. When I think to the 2023 scuba data, you were definitely more likely to see some subcanopy kelps and somewhat higher densities of some of subcanopy kelps than you were to see bull kelp. So in some ways, it's probably hit bull kelp even harder than subcanopy species, although I would not say that our subcanopy kelps are doing well either.
Well, lots of questions coming in. Here's one from afar. We've got some participants, perhaps from Northern California. Taking the lessons and best practices you've learned in Oregon, what recommendations do you have for us in Monterey Bay in general?
Oh, I kind of feel like we take a lot of cues and lessons from California. California got, you know, there have been there's been kelp forest stewardship work, like urchin removals going on in California since like at least the 1960s. It hasn't been everywhere. It's only been in specific places. Um, and additionally, in the last 10 years, there's been a huge outpouring of work, particularly in Northern California. And so we actually take a lot of cues from our partners in California. For example, the kelp recovery platforms. That was an idea that was originally piloted in California that we're bringing here. Um, Sunflower sea star captive breeding is actually already ongoing in California, and they're starting to try to outplant these captively bred sea stars in some areas near Monterey Bay. Um, So I'm trying to think what we have going on here in Oregon that people in California might take note of. I think one thing that's kind of interesting about Oregon, and one thing I love about Oregon is kind of like the working waterfronts. There's a lot of waterfronts that are run by industry and fishermen as opposed to coastal development and tourism and things like that. And so I feel really lucky that we get to work with a lot of urchin divers to do our work, and we get to work with ports and things like that. So I think that's been key to some of the success we've had here in Oregon is working with our fishing communities, coastal industry, just because those are more of the people on the water and in the water. And so perhaps that's a lesson that California could take. I know that there is great work on that front going on in California, but yeah, I'm very grateful to my partners in California that share so much of their knowledge with us, and we're able to leverage that into as much success as we've had so far.
Well, I think that's an indication of the great work you're doing is that California is now taking note of what you're doing. Another question that came in is how does kelp affect sand transport?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing we know about kelp forests is that they tend to slow down water movement. So that's both like currents tend to get slowed down as they're moving through kelp forests as they interact with that 3D vegetation in the water column. And also waves that are moving across kelp tend to get dampened a little bit. The waves aren't as high, aren't as strong. And so in general, kelp forests kind of slow down water movement. And so I think that would have a lot of implications for sand transport, probably in less sand being transported because there's more barriers to that water that's kind of moving that sand along. But that's a very good coastal geomorphology question that is maybe a little outside of my area of expertise.
Okay, another question from Andy. Do you have any understanding about the genetic diversity within the Oregon population of bull kelp as compared to other West Coast populations?
I wish we did. There have not been any genetic studies on Oregon's kelp populations. I would love to see that happen. One kind of interesting thing that's come out from other places like Washington, British Columbia, California over the last decade or so of investigation into kelp genetics is that these populations tend to be more mixed than you would guess. So it's like, I think I remember seeing a study that from like California up through Alaska, there were four major subpopulations of kelps that were all kind of intermixed. So that's a pretty big area to only have four kind of subpopulations. And so a number of studies I've seen indicate that there is mixing of populations over hundreds of kilometers, hundreds of miles. And so my guess would be that Oregon's kelp forests are actually kind of one larger population that's exchanging genetic material fairly regularly. Um, but we don't know. And one question I really have that I think there could be some cool genetic answers to is how are Oregon's kelps adapted to temperature here? We have different temperature regimes than California or Washington. And are our kelps adapted to different kinds of temperature, maybe lower temperatures? And does that change up and down the coast? So lots more to learn.
A question on scaling up. The techniques you use are, you might call them experimental, but it hasn't been done before. What are the challenges to scale up to work at a landscape level?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Um, so I think maybe I have two ideas. One is that every year that we do this, we figure out how to do it better. And we're looking for ways to make it more efficient, to reduce costs, reduce the amount of time and energy we need. So, things like being able to culture our own kelps on land, like in a tumble culture or a mariculture facility. And then we could really expand the use of our kelp restoration platforms, the growing kelp on those platforms, if we had kind of mariculture kelp on demand here in Oregon, the way they do actually in California. And so that could really scale up our spore enhancement work. Um, so one of it is kind of techniques. And then another answer to that is that there are some parts of this work that are just intensive, like urchin removals. Removed 216,000 urchins from Nellie's Cove last year, and there's still more urchins in there, you know? That's a lot of people power, that's money, that's boat time, um, to do that work. And so there's some ways in which things like urchin removal, are not gonna they're not going to scale up to a landscape scale. Like we're never going to be able to send out enough urchin divers to get rid of the millions of urchins at Orford Reef or something like that. And we recognize that. And so that's one of the reasons that we are pursuing predator recovery is because while it's not really, on the landscape scale, the whole state scale, it's not scalable to do urchin removal by hand, by human hand. If sunflower sea stars were back in the picture in a real way, they can eat a lot of urchins. And so recovering predators in the system is something that scales up at a landscape scale, at a statewide scale. So I think we actually think really carefully about scale, and we try to be thoughtful and explicit about when we're pursuing strategies that work at a small scale, where we're trying to maintain oases of local kelp populations for long enough that we don't lose the kelp entirely. And then there's kind of larger scale, longer term solutions, like predator recovery that can work across the whole state.
Thank you. Comment in the chat was such a great presentation. Will you be doing urchin eradication at Cape Foulweather? And they note that it's a tough terrain.
Our plan is to this year. We are still working with ODF&W to obtain the letters of authorization, the LOA to do so. But they are waiting on us to get them some scuba survey data. Um, but if we are able to obtain that, then our plan is we may work with volunteer divers some, but probably a lot with commercial divers. Some of those sites that are, as you say, kind of tough terrain, they're really wave exposed or they're hard to get to or something like that. Those can be really good places to work with the commercial divers because they can, be out on the boat all day long. They can work at places that maybe your average scuba diver isn't comfortable working. So that is our hope for the year. And I'll check in with you in October and I'll let you know how we did.
Thank you. Another question was, is ODFW fully on board with projects that ORKA's doing? And how have they worked to help, or has it been difficulties too?
Um, I think the first few years of ORKA was there was a lot of trust building with ODF&W. We kind of came out of nowhere and wanted to move really fast because we felt things were very urgent. And they were like, whoa, 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 who are you? What is this? They didn't have any, kelp forest restoration's never been done in Oregon before. But I do feel like we're getting to a place where there is a level of like we have a relationship with ODF&W, and there is some level of trust that we know a little bit of what we're doing, and that we will take good data and we will report back to them and we will work with them on topics. And so I do feel like we're actually have a decent relationship with ODF&W. I think that the fact that they were willing to work with us to get these letters of authorization so that we can do culling at these specific sites. When I tell people in British Columbia or California that ODF&W lets us do that, they're like, how? Our fisheries management would never, ever let us do that. And they're like, and we've been working on it for 15 years. So ODF&W has worked with us on those LOAs. They are being good partners in working with us on developing the idea of sunflower sea star captive breeding and translocations here in Oregon. They're hearing what we have to say. They're taking us seriously. They're asking us to, use the best available science and protocols. Um, so, I think we ask a lot of ODF and W. Like I say, we feel very strongly that this is urgent and a lot needs to happen. And I feel like they are doing a pretty good job working with us the best that they can, given that they're kind of like a big bureaucratic state agency.
Well, I see a lot of relationships building too. When you were doing culling at Cape Kiwanda, we were providing some of the shore support, and the dory boat fisher people really took notice and were appreciative of the work you're doing. So I think it builds relationships not only with the agencies but also with the community and the fishing fleet. There was a question. This is a good one. How old does a sun star need to be, or large enough to start eating urchins?
Oh man, I wish I had a picture of this in here. But actually, when I went down to the Sunflower Sea Star Lab in Moss Landing, I have a picture of a sunflower sea star that's about this big, so maybe the size of, I don't know, the bottom of a coffee mug. Um, Eating a purple urchin that's about this big, so maybe the size of like a dime or something like that. So they actually can eat a lot of urchins at a very young age, and they do that. Sunflower sea star was probably not more than a year old, and it was already able to chomp down a lot of juvenile urchins. So they are voracious.
And as far as kelp nursery, I think you talked about growing kelp on site on platforms. What about growing kelp on shore in facilities and then translocating?
Yeah, we are very interested in that. That will help us scale up our spore enhancement work. So we've been kind of trying to do that, and we've struggled a little bit to find the right facilities to do it at, particularly given that we're working on the South Coast. There's not a lot of mariculture facilities that we can draw from there to do that work. So um, we are working on figuring out where's a good place to do it with the right infrastructure. I'm hopeful that we could actually get something going at the Port of Port Orford in the next year or so. But we're also looking into some facilities in the Newport area. Um, so yes, that is one of the next big kind of next steps in our work is getting that land-based kelp culture going so we have kelps on demand.
Another question is how long does it take bull kelp to mature? And by mature, I probably means reaching a full
Yeah.
canopy.
Yeah, so bull kelp is actually an annual species. It generally goes through its full life cycle in a year. And so the little baby kelps we tend to think of them kind of recruiting or like ending up on the seafloor in like spring. And then they grow all over the summer. And by late summer, early fall, they've started to mature reproductively and they start dropping their spores. And they do that really intensively through the fall, and then kind of it peters off in the winter. And a lot of them will get ripped out and killed by big winter storms. So it's both kind of a blessing and a curse, because on the one hand, you can get, when you're working with bull kelp, such a fast species, you can get recovery really quickly. Like I was saying, within like a couple of months, we were seeing bull kelp forest back at Macklin Cove, which is awesome. But it also means that you can kind of lose them quickly as well. If there's a couple years where there's a whole lot of urchins in there, it can really kind of cut off the momentum of that population. So yeah, they live fast, die young, kind of.
We've got a couple more questions, and I think we have a bit of time left to answer questions. There's one. What about OIMB, the Marine Science Center for Cultivating?
Yeah, yeah, I would be. Um, that could be a suitable site as well. Um, it's a little bit of just our where do we currently know people and already have relationships and connections. We do work with some folks at OIMB. So that could be another facility as well. We're also keeping OIMB in mind in terms of potential sunflower sea star captive breeding in the future. We are interested in that. Again, sometimes we run into it's just kind of like capacity issues. We're a small team. And so I think there would be interest. We would just need to find some time and energy to focus on actually getting a culture going at OIMB. And we don't currently have a pathway for that.
Other questions from the audience? I saw, William, if you had a hand up, if I can figure out how to unmute you, I will do so. Other questions? Sara, any closing comments, thoughts that you'd want to leave people with?
No, I think I got them off my chest already. I guess I would just say I'm always so grateful and impressed when people want to get off after a long day of work and come listen to me talk for an hour of their personal time. So thank you so much for your interest and being here. It means a lot. It keeps us passionate, keeps us going to see that people care about this work.
William, you had a hand up. Did you have a comment you wanted to share? You are on mute, but you can unmute that, I think.
Thank you. No comment.
Great.
Well, I
Well,
don't see, or go
yeah,
ahead.
my email is there if anybody wants to follow up with me. There's my email, or you can follow up with ORKA on its website or its socials. And thank you again, Kent and Seven Capes Bird Alliance, for being such good hosts.
Well, we are very impressed with all the work that ORKA does, and thank you so much for participating in this series. And I think it's off to a good start. I hope all of you in the audience come back on May 7th. It'll be a lot more information, no pun intended, diving into details on the sunflower star ecology and some of the work that's being done on restoring them. So thanks so much, and thanks to everybody in the audience for participating. And like I said, more information will be available at sevencapes.org, and also the recording will be available there. But again, thank you, Sara. Wonderful, wonderful talk.
Thank you, Kent.
And good night to all.
Good night.